Some years ago, I got to witness a baptism that looked very different than any other baptism I had seen before. It was right after seminary. We were living in DC as I was working as a hospital chaplain there for the year. And the church we worshiped at that year was Church of the Pilgrims. It's a Presbyterian church just off of DuPont Circle. A few years before we had gotten there, they had redone their sanctuary to give it a lot more space and movement and be more interactive, where people sat and worshiped. And the Sunday was a great reason why. That baptism Sunday, the baptismal font wasn't at the front of the church as we have it now. It was actually dead center, right in the middle of where everyone was seated. That was the first unique thing. As the family came up with their 6-month-old daughter to come and be baptized, they didn't come to the front. They went to the middle of where everyone was seated. This was pre-COVID. And there they went with the 2 pastors who gathered all together around the baptismal font. Now, the first part of this baptism looked very, very familiar to me. The pastors came by the waters and they shared the promises God makes in baptism, why we baptize, what the promises are from God, from the church, from parents and families, what these waters mean. And then they asked some questions for the church members, how they would support and surround this child with love and care. They asked questions for the family members, and then they offered their own blessing upon this water. Right after that, I thought surely they were going to take this child and pour the water on the forehead, but they wanted to do something else first, something I hadn't seen before. After the pastors offered their blessing over the water for the Holy Spirit to be at work, for God to claim in these waters this child as part of God's family, they then turned to the congregation around them and they asked the members of this church, if anyone would like, we invite you to come to this fount, to dip your hands into the water, and then to offer your blessing for this child this day. Now, sitting there, I thought, well, this sounds nice, but I know Presbyterians, and there's a reason we're often called the frozen chosen. No one's going to get up and do this, right? We think that, leave that to the pros. We don't need to be the ones to go up and say words. But to my utter surprise, member after member came to that baptismal font and surrounded the family. And one by one, they dipped their hands into that water and they offered their promise and blessing to the child. It was absolutely beautiful. And I remember one of those blessings most of all. It came from a member who was a very close friend of the family. Right away, you could see how much she loved this family and loved this child. I think she had already held this child many, many times in her arms and spent time with it. And right as she was going to give her blessing and promise, you could already see tears forming on her cheeks. But then as she dipped her hands into the water, she said these powerful words. She said, "Dear child of God, we promise to be there with you in all of the times to come. We promise to be with you in the joyful times, your very first steps, your first day of school, the first time that you fall in love, your first dance recital, the time you go off to school. We promise to be with you in all the big times of decision making, when you start to consider faith for your own, when you see gifts and start following a call, when you go off to college or work and have to trust that you have something to offer to this world, we will be there with you." And then she dipped her hand in the water again, and she said words that really surprised me, but I needed to hear as well. And she said, "Child of God, we also promise to be with you in the difficult times. We'll be with you that first time you fail at something in life, the first time your heart ever gets broken in love, the times that you get sick and the times you experience loss, the times where you feel all alone, the times where you don't know what to do next. We will be with you, and we'll be there, surrounding you with our love, our presence, and our care." It was that last section that really surprised me. Because for me, when I think about baptism, I often think about, well, carrying the baby through the aisles and everyone waving and smiling, and really the joyful, happy times that are all to come after that. The moments of learning and Sunday school, of going off to church camp, of service trips, of confirmation, all those times of maybe going for their first time doing a solo or dancing or doing something in school. I think of those joyful times we get to surround them with. But I needed to hear her name as well, those difficult times, because we all know that life throws more at us than just those joyful, cheery times. And life throws more at every child we baptize too. We wish it wasn't so. We wish every child who came to this baptismal font that as soon as those waters got upon them, everything is going to be easy and smooth from there on out. But we know from our own experience that's not the case for anyone. We know that while there will be days of celebration and love and community, there's also going to be days of struggle, days of sickness, days of great loss, days of grief. There's going to be days where that child gets their heart broken. And there's days we all know where we don't know where to turn to for strength or direction. And where days where we truly may feel all alone, or we may feel the waters are way over our head. The power of baptism, though, the powers of those waters that we baptize children and adults and anyone who comes for the first time to that fount. The power of baptism is that the promise of God made in those waters, they're true no matter what our journey of life takes us. They're true in the good days, but they're true as well in the difficult and hard days. They're true in the days where faith is just something that we're living out great. They're also true in the days where we may have forgotten God for a long time, or we may have done things that hurt ourselves or hurt others. This promise of God is true in the days we know lots of joy, and also the days that we really miss a loved one who has passed recently. God's promise to be there with us is true in all those moments. God's promises never, ever change. And that's the reason we as Presbyterians, we don't actually do a second baptism. It's not because we as Presbyterians are prudish, or that we think somewhere there's a scarcity of baptismal water and we need to save it. We can't pour more baptismal water out. That's not the case at all. The reason we don't offer a second baptism is that we believe that that first baptism, the promises made in it from God, never, ever, ever go away. No matter how faithful or unfaithful you may feel your journey has been, no matter how straight or narrow it's been, or windy or hilly it's been, God's promise that you are a beloved child of God, that you are precious in God's sight, that you are worthy and filled with the Holy Spirit, that never, ever changes or goes away. No matter what waters you walk through, God's promises continue. Today in our reading from Isaiah 43, we hear these words from God spoken to us. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. As followers of Jesus, we're not promised that life is going to be always safe or easy or comfortable. We might think that maybe on the outside, that people in the church, they have it all figured out. Everything's going smooth and easy. But for any of us who are inside, who've been a part of a church, we know that's definitely never the case. And that's never what Jesus promises. In fact, what he often says to his disciples is that if you follow me, things are not going to get easier or safer or more comfortable, that they're actually going to get more dangerous and rocky and difficult and challenging. Because what Jesus calls us to in this life of discipleship is to do things that take risk, that are a bit strange, that are a bit different, to show God's love and light and care and grace to the world. So no, we're not promised that following Jesus is going to be a smooth, easy path. But what we are promised from God this day is that God will be with there in all of those waters. This week, at our staff meeting time, we talked about baptism. And to open up about baptism, I asked staff who were there what their thoughts are when it comes to water, what their first thing is when they think about just the gift of water, what first comes to mind. I shared that for me, I first thought about this past summer. I'm from the north, and so summers here in Virginia, I find a bit very hot and humid and oppressive. I might be alone with that. Maybe some of you think, well, that's great, that heat and humidity in summer, and this is the time you hate. I love this weather, and summer is just super hard. But for me, this past summer, what was really wonderful was our 2-year-old daughter, Alana. She was finally big enough for one of those puddle jumpers. And behind our home in our community, we had a pool that stayed open every night till 8 p.m. And so every day after long hours of work in the church, and then my wife working at a continuous care facility, and still doing summer with COVID, I was beginning to have conversation with Bon Air, but a lot of just different questions and stress and worries and heat of the day. That 1 hour each night going into that pool, into that water, felt like such a relief. It felt like a sacred hour. And I can remember every night swimming and seeing Alana swim and play on her own. And then every moment when I just put my head under for the first time, feeling that enveloped by water, felt like a holy moment where God was there taking away all stress and relief. And that was my moment. Other staff shared maybe water was a reminder of life and parching when they have parched throats, drinking from that. The water reminded them of joyful times playing. And then we got to Steve Henley, our music director, who is from the Philadelphia area, and maybe growing up there, maybe, I'm not quite sure, maybe going to the Jersey Shore where it can be some bigger waves. He shared that for him, what water first reminded him of is danger. And he thought about going to the ocean and the waves crashing on the beach and the undertow can pull you out, and how there's real danger and risk in some waters and how it's not always safe being in water. It's a good reminder to me that we have different waters to go through. It also maybe told me that Steve isn't the biggest beach person out there. And then later on in the week, I got a phone call from one of our members, Amy Compton, who's here in the sanctuary with us today. And she, knowing that this Sunday was going to be Baptism of the Lord Sunday, she shared with me a moment that felt like a baptism, maybe baptism by fire in water for her. It was while she was doing PhD work that she found some time one week to take her kayak and go to the New River. At the time, she felt like she could take on any water, any rapid. And so she was kayaking on a sit-on-top kayak going down the river, and she passed some rapids, and passing them, she was fine. But she looked back and saw, those rapids look pretty fun. And so she went back to that rapid, thinking, let's try to do some tricks. And immediately as she got to the rapid, the kayak flipped and she's penned underwater. And I don't know if any of you have ever been penned underwater, but whether it's for 5 seconds or 50 seconds, it feels like an eternity. It feels like absolutely forever. And in that moment, I think everything else that seemed to matter to Amy, maybe competing with other PhD students, showing off, doing everything the world expected from her, her own sense of pride, and I need to get these tasks done, all of that melted away and was taken away. And instead, while she was under that water, she just had one clear thought, and that is, I need to get my next breath. I need to know that Spirit of God once more. I need to know that moment of life. And as her head finally emerged from the water and she took that deep breath, she remembered that moment, not a safe, easy moment, a dangerous and scary moment in troubled waters, but a moment where she knew God was with her. And she remembered what was so important and valuable about life. Thank you, Amy, for sharing that story. It was a good reminder that God promises to be with us in all the waters we go through. Those joyful waters of swimming pools, those scary waters of the ocean, and even the troubling waters of rapids where we might know real difficult and dangerous and scary times. That God promises to be with us, loving us, claiming us, and reminding us who we truly are. this week as I remember that promise that God is going to be with us wherever we go, whatever waters we face, whether the waters feel like they're waist high and we can splash and play, or whether they feel like they're above our head and we don't know where our next breath is going to come from. So remember that great promise of God. A question kept coming to mind for me. And that is, if God is in those waters, if God says, I'll be in that water with you, whether it's safe water, whether it's difficult water, whether it's joyful water, whether it's water of grief or sorrow or hunger or thirst, I will be there. It made me wonder, what waters do we as a church go into? Do we stay on the shore where it's safe? Do we put our toes in? Do we go just in the waters where it's easy or safe or comfortable or warm? Or do we as a church go into the tough waters too? When we see neighbors who are hungry or lacking housing, can we jump into those waters? We know people who have lost loved ones and are grieving. Can we jump into those waters too? We know people have doubts and questions about faith or God or their journey. Can we jump into those waters and say, I have doubts too, and questions are a part of faith? When people are in the waters where they feel like maybe I'm not worthy of God's love or claim, can we jump into those waters and say, I've made mistakes as well, but God's love is greater? I think that's our big question for this week. So remember all the waters God jumps into, all the waters where God is active and present and loving and offering grace and mercy. How can we, as the Church of Jesus Christ, be in those same waters, offering whatever love or care we can as well?